somewhere in the quiet middle of America, long before the sun had any intention of rising, a single kitchen light would flicker on. It was always the same hour, give or take a few minutes, because a milkman's day did not begin with an alarm clock so much as it began with a habit so deeply worn into his body that his eyes opened on their own, sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, no matter the season, no matter how cold the window glass had become overnight. Winter changed everything about this hour without changing the hour itself. In summer, 3 in the morning held a kind of soft blue stillness, the promise of warmth already sitting in the air. In winter, 3 in the morning was simply dark and cold and silent in the particular way that only deep winter silence can be, a silence with weight to it, as though the entire town had been folded under a blanket of frost and forgotten until morning. The milkman's house, like most houses in this story, was modest. A small wooden frame structure with a porch that creaked under snow, a chimney that worked overtime through the coldest months, and windows that fogged with condensation on the inside from the difference between the warmth of the kitchen stove and the biting air pressing against the glass from outside. He would rise from bed carefully, trying not to wake his wife or children, though most milkman families grew so accustomed to this early rising that even the youngest child rarely stirred. The floorboards were cold under his feet, and the first task of the morning, every single morning, was not breakfast, not coffee, but simply getting warm enough to function. He would build up the stove if it had burned low overnight, feeding in kindling and a few split logs, watching the orange light catch and spread, feeling that first wave of heat reach his hands. Then came the layers of clothing, thick wool socks, sometimes 2 pairs, long underwear beneath his work trousers, a heavy flannel shirt, and over all of it, the same coat he wore every winter morning until it was practically part of his identity in the eyes of the town. Some milkmen owned a canvas coat lined with sheepskin. Others wore military surplus wool overcoats bought second-hand, patched at the elbows, smelling faintly of mothballs and cold air no matter how many times they were washed. Boots were essential, and a good milkman took his boots more seriously than almost any other piece of equipment he owned, aside from his truck or his horse. Rubber-soled boots with thick wool lining, sometimes homemade insoles cut from old blankets, anything to keep the feet warm during the long hours of standing, walking, climbing in and out of a vehicle, and trudging up unshoveled porch steps in the dark. Coffee, when there was time for it, was strong and black, drunk quickly, more for the warmth in the hands and the alertness in the mind than for any pleasure in the taste. Many milkmen skipped breakfast entirely in the coldest months, preferring to eat something small and quick after the first hour or 2 of work, once their body had warmed itself through movement, and the initial shock of the cold morning air had faded into something more manageable. And then, before the rest of the town had even considered waking, the milkman stepped outside into the dark. The milkman's day did not begin at his own house, not really. It began at the dairy, sometimes called the creamery, a low building usually found near the edge of town or along a rail line, humming quietly with machinery even at this impossible hour. The dairy was where the milk had already been gathered from surrounding farms the evening before or earlier that same night, cooled, tested, bottled, and prepared for the long morning of delivery. Walking into the dairy in the deep cold of a winter morning was its own particular experience. The building itself was kept cool by necessity. Refrigeration depended on ice, and later mechanical cooling systems, but even mechanical systems in this era were far less efficient than what would come decades later. So the air inside was often nearly as cold as the air outside, just without the wind. What made the dairy feel different from the freezing world beyond its walls was the sound. The low mechanical hum of bottling equipment, the clink and rattle of glass bottles being washed, filled, capped, and stacked into wire carrying crates, and the low voices of the handful of workers who kept the operation running through the darkest hours. The bottles themselves were glass, heavy in the hand, thick-walled to survive the daily abuse of being carried, set down, picked back up, washed, refilled, and carried again, sometimes for years before a bottle finally cracked or shattered. Each bottle carried the dairy's name pressed into the glass, sometimes a small town crest or a simple illustration of a cow, a farm, or a milk pail. In winter, these bottles arrived already carrying a faint chill from the dairy's cooling room, and within minutes of being carried outside, the cold air would deepen that chill considerably. This detail mattered more than most people today would expect, because winter created a very specific problem for milk delivery that summer never did: freezing. If a bottle of milk sat outside for too long in deep winter cold, the milk itself would begin to freeze, expanding as it froze, and in some cases popping the cardboard cap right off the top of the bottle, pushing upward with a slow, strange little column of frozen cream. Milkmen and dairies developed all sorts of small strategies to prevent this. Insulated delivery boxes on porches, thicker glass, faster delivery routes, and timing that tried to place milk in the coldest exposed positions for the shortest possible window before someone brought it inside. The milkman would arrive at the dairy in the dark, park whatever vehicle he used that season, and begin the process of loading his morning supply. This was physical work, repetitive and demanding even before the actual delivery route began. Wire crates, each holding a dozen or more bottles, were stacked and loaded into the delivery vehicle in a specific order, not randomly, but arranged according to the route he would drive that morning, so that the bottles needed first were accessible first, and the ones needed last were buried deeper in the load. A good milkman knew his route so well that he could have arranged these crates half asleep, and on the coldest mornings, that was almost literally true. For a very long stretch of this profession's history, the vehicle of choice was not a truck at all, but a horse-drawn wagon, and in more towns, and for far longer than modern audiences often assume, the horse remained a working partner in the milk delivery business well into the era when automobiles had already become common on America's streets. This was especially true in winter, for reasons that had everything to do with practicality and very little to do with nostalgia. A horse, it turned out, was remarkably well suited to the specific demands of a milk route in snow and ice. Trucks of the era, particularly older or poorly maintained ones, struggled on icy roads, got stuck in snowdrifts, and required a driver's full attention at every moment. A horse, especially one that had walked the same route for months or years, required almost no direction at all. Milkmen frequently told the same story, passed down through families and small-town memory. The horse knew the route better than any new employee ever could. It would walk from house to house, pause automatically at each regular stop, and wait patiently while the milkman hopped down, delivered bottles, collected empties, and hopped back onto the wagon, at which point the horse would begin walking again toward the next stop entirely on its own. This allowed the milkman to work with extraordinary efficiency. Instead of needing to steer, brake, and navigate at every single stop the way a truck driver would, he could focus entirely on the physical task of carrying bottles up icy steps, exchanging empty bottles for full ones, and occasionally leaving a handwritten note if a customer had special requests, perhaps an extra quart for a Sunday gathering, or a note asking for buttermilk instead of the usual sweet cream. The horses themselves were treated with real care by milkmen who depended on them so completely. A blanket was often placed over the horse's back during long stops, particularly on the coldest mornings, to prevent the animal's muscles from stiffening in the cold. Some milkmen carried a small supply of oats or a treat to reward the horse at the end of a long route. The relationship between milkman and horse, repeated daily for years at a time, became something closer to a working partnership than a simple case of a man using an animal as a tool. As trucks became more reliable and more common through the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, the horse-drawn wagon slowly faded from most towns, though it lingered longest in smaller and more rural communities, where the cost of maintaining a truck, along with the challenge of navigating unpaved or poorly maintained winter roads, made the horse the more practical choice for years longer than city dairies required. When trucks did take over, they brought their own winter challenges. Early delivery trucks had minimal heating, sometimes none at all beyond what leaked in from the engine. Windshields frosted over from the inside due to the driver's own breath, requiring milkmen to scrape ice not only from the outside of the glass before starting the route, but periodically from the inside as well, using a rag or a gloved hand to clear a small viewing patch as they drove. Tires had far less traction than modern tires, and chains were sometimes wrapped around the rear tires specifically for snow and ice conditions, a task the milkman often performed himself in the dark, kneeling in the snow outside the dairy before his route even began. Despite these challenges, the truck offered undeniable advantages: greater capacity for bottles, faster travel between stops, and the ability to cover a larger territory in the same amount of time a horse-drawn wagon would need for a much smaller route. Dairies expanded their delivery areas as trucks became standard, and the profession itself began to change shape, requiring fewer milkmen to cover more homes, though the daily rhythm of pre-dawn starts and door-to-door delivery remained essentially unchanged for decades. Whether by horse or by truck, the actual work of delivery followed a rhythm so consistent that milkmen across the country, despite never having met one another, would have recognized each other's daily routine almost instantly. The route was memorized, not written down, at least not in any document the milkman needed to consult during his morning drive. He knew which houses took a quart, which took two, which took cream on Sundays only, which family had recently had a baby and now needed extra milk for the household, and which elderly widow down the street had recently cut back her order because she now lived alone. This knowledge accumulated slowly, built through months and years of the same repeated route, and it created a strange kind of intimacy between the milkman and the town he served, an intimacy built almost entirely without conversation, since most deliveries happened while the customers themselves were still asleep. The delivery itself required a particular kind of quiet competence. The milkman would approach a porch in the dark, guided mostly by memory and the dim light of a street lamp or the glow of his own vehicle's headlights, carrying a wire basket loaded with however many bottles that household required. He would lift the lid of the insulated delivery box that many households kept specifically for this purpose, a small wooden or metal box near the front door, designed to protect the milk from direct sunlight in summer and to offer some minimal protection from freezing in winter, though this protection was never perfect. He would exchange the previous day's empty bottles for the day's fresh delivery, careful not to let the glass clink too loudly against the porch or against itself, since a loud clatter of bottles at 4 in the morning was one of the fastest ways to earn an irritated glance from a customer through their bedroom window. In deep winter, this simple exchange became considerably more complicated. Porches iced over, steps became treacherous. The milkman's own boots, already carrying snow and slush from the previous house, needed to find sure footing on surfaces that shifted unpredictably beneath him. Falls were common enough that most milkmen developed something close to a specialized gait for navigating icy steps while carrying a heavy, clattering load of bottles, walking with knees slightly bent, weight low, movement slow and deliberate rather than rushed. Some towns required milkmen to also collect payment during their rounds, though many operated on a monthly billing system instead, where customers settled their account once a month rather than paying per delivery. In towns using the direct payment method, the milkman carried a coin changer on his belt, and the sound of that mechanical device, a series of small metal tubes releasing exact change with a satisfying click, became one of the small, recognizable sounds of early morning, alongside the clop of horse hooves or the low idle of a truck engine, and the muffled crunch of boots in snow. Between houses, the cold pressed in constantly, Fingers grew stiff despite gloves, faces grew numb despite scarves wrapped high, and breath came out in visible clouds that hung in the still winter air before slowly dissipating. Many milkmen developed small rituals to manage this discomfort, flexing their fingers repeatedly inside their gloves, tucking their chin lower into their coat collar between houses, or keeping a small flask of hot coffee in the truck's cab, taken in short sips during brief pauses between the most distant stops on the route. A milk route in winter engaged the senses in a way that later generations, accustomed to supermarket refrigerators and plastic jugs, would find difficult to fully imagine. The cold itself had a smell, a clean, sharp scent that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, mixing with the smell of wood smoke rising from chimneys as households began their own mornings. The smell of the horse if a horse was still part of the operation, warm and animal and comforting in its familiarity, or the smell of gasoline and oil if a truck had taken the horse's place. Sound carried differently in the winter cold, especially in the hours before dawn when the rest of the town remained silent. The milkman's footsteps in snow made a particular compressed crunch, different depending on the snow's age and temperature. Fresh powder made almost no sound at all, while older snow that had partially melted and refrozen crunched sharply with each step, almost like walking on a thin layer of broken glass. The clink of bottles, the creak of a wagon's wheels, or the low rumble of a truck engine, the occasional distant bark of a dog disturbed by the milkman's passing, and very rarely, the voice of an early rising customer calling out a quiet greeting or a small request through a cracked window. These were the sounds that defined the hour. Frost coated everything in these early morning hours. The milk bottles themselves, the delivery boxes, the railings of porches, the milkman's own eyebrows and eyelashes after enough time in the cold air. Streetlights, where they existed, cast a dim yellow glow through the frozen air, sometimes ringed with a faint halo caused by ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere, a phenomenon country milkmen occasionally noticed and commented on to one another when their routes happened to overlap at a shared stretch of road. Though the milkman's work happened largely in silence and in darkness, it was, at its core, deeply relational. He did not simply deliver a product. He maintained dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small, ongoing relationships with families who trusted him with a task most of them never thought twice about, precisely because he performed it so reliably. Consider, for a moment, the sheer number of small facts a milkman carried in his memory at any given time. He knew that the Hendersons at the corner house preferred buttermilk on Fridays because Mrs. Henderson baked biscuits every weekend. He knew that the young couple 2 streets over had just had their first child and now required double their usual order, and he made a mental note to ask, gently and without prying, how the baby was sleeping the next time he happened to see either parent during a delivery. He knew that old Mr. Whitfield, a widower living alone since his wife had passed the previous spring, had quietly reduced his order from a quart a day to a quart every other day, and the milkman never mentioned this change aloud, understanding without being told exactly what it represented. This kind of quiet, accumulated knowledge made the milkman something like an informal record keeper of the town's rhythms. He noticed things. He noticed when a house's order suddenly stopped altogether, and sometimes this meant a family had moved away, and sometimes it meant something sadder, and either way, he adjusted his route accordingly without comment. He noticed when a new family moved in and awkwardly flagged him down on his very first morning driving past their house, unsure of how the whole system worked, and he would patiently explain the process. Leave a note in the empty bottle if you want to change your order. Place your empties out each evening, and the fresh delivery would appear before you woke. Winter added its own layer to these relationships. Some families, worried about their milk freezing on the porch during the coldest weeks of the year, would leave a note asking the milkman to knock quietly and hand the bottles directly to whoever answered the door, rather than leaving them in the usual delivery box. This request, though it slowed the milkman's route slightly, was almost always honored without complaint, because milkmen understood the particular anxieties winter created for a product this fragile and easily ruined by frost. Occasionally, in the very coldest and most remote stretches of certain routes, a milkman would find that a bottle from his previous delivery had frozen solid overnight, its cardboard cap pushed several inches upward by a tower of frozen cream, comic in appearance but genuinely wasteful, representing a small loss for both the dairy and the family who had paid for milk they could no longer safely drink. Milkmen took a strange professional pride in minimizing these frozen losses, treating it almost as a personal failure when it happened too frequently on a particular stretch of the route, and adjusting their timing or their conversations with affected households accordingly. There were also, in every town, a handful of houses where the milkman's arrival meant more than simple commerce. Elderly customers living alone sometimes came to rely on the milkman's daily visit as one of the only predictable social contacts in their day, however brief. Some milkmen, aware of this quiet reliance, made a habit of pausing for just a moment longer at these houses, offering a friendly word through a cracked door, or checking that a porch light had been left on the night before as a sign that all was well inside. In more than a few documented cases from this era of American life, a milkman noticing an unusual sign, an untouched bottle from the previous day, an unlit house that was normally lit, snow undisturbed on a porch that should have shown footprints, became the first person to raise an alarm that something inside the house was wrong, sometimes summoning help that arrived just in time. This was never officially part of the job description. No dairy company trained its milkmen to serve as informal welfare checkers for the elderly and isolated members of their community. It emerged naturally from the simple fact that the milkman was, in many towns, one of the only people whose daily presence at a specific hour created a reliable pattern that neighbors and family members could notice the absence of, should something go wrong. Behind the quiet ritual of the morning route sat an entire economic structure that shaped nearly every decision the milkman made, from the size of his load to the exact timing of his stops. Dairies operated on thin margins, particularly smaller, independent operations competing against larger regional companies that could benefit from economies of scale. Milk itself was a low-margin product, and much of the dairy's actual profit came from products like cream, butter, and cottage cheese, which commanded higher prices and offered more room for profit than a simple bottle of whole milk. The milkman himself was typically paid a modest wage, sometimes supplemented by a small commission structure tied to the total volume of his route or the number of new customers he managed to bring onto his delivery schedule. In many dairies, milkmen were expected to function partly as informal salesmen, gently encouraging existing customers to add cream to their order, or to try a new product the dairy had recently begun bottling, such as chocolate milk, which grew steadily in popularity through the middle decades of the 20th century, as dairies looked for ways to differentiate themselves and increase the average value of each household's order. Winter created its own specific economic pressures. Frozen and ruined bottles represented direct losses that dairies tracked carefully, and routes that consistently showed higher rates of frozen product in winter months sometimes prompted management to reconsider delivery timing, insulation methods, or even whether certain especially exposed or distant stops were worth the cost of servicing during the coldest months of the year. There was also the simple challenge of keeping delivery vehicles operational through winter conditions that were considerably harder on both horses and trucks than the milder months. A horse required extra feed to maintain its energy and body heat during cold weather, and dairies that still relied on horse-drawn delivery factored this increased cost into their winter budgets. Trucks required regular maintenance to keep engines running reliably in cold start conditions, and a truck that failed to start on a frigid morning could delay an entire route by hours, a problem serious enough that many dairies kept a mechanic on call specifically for early morning emergencies during the winter season. Despite these challenges, the home delivery model persisted and even thrived for a remarkably long stretch of American history, supported by a simple economic logic. Refrigeration technology in ordinary American homes remained limited or entirely absent for much of this era, meaning that fresh daily delivery was not merely a convenience, but often a practical necessity. A family without reliable home refrigeration genuinely needed milk delivered fresh, in small enough quantities to be consumed before spoiling, making the milkman's daily visit an essential service rather than a luxury. The specific experience of delivering milk in winter varied enormously depending on where in the country a milkman worked, and these regional differences shaped nearly every practical decision involved in the job. In the upper Midwest and parts of New England, winter cold reached depths that made the freezing of milk bottles an almost daily concern for months at a time. Milkmen in these regions developed the most elaborate strategies for protecting their product. Heavily insulated delivery boxes lined with layers of newspaper or wool, delivery schedules adjusted to place the most exposed stops as late as possible in the route when the sun had begun to provide at least marginal warming, and in some particularly harsh communities, an informal system where neighbors watched for each other's deliveries and brought a nearby household's milk inside if that family happened to be away. Further south, in regions where winter brought cold temperatures but rarely the extreme, sustained deep freezes of the northern states, milkmen faced a different and in some ways more unpredictable challenge. Winter weather that swung dramatically from mild to bitterly cold within the same week, sometimes within the same day, making it difficult to establish a consistent seasonal routine the way northern milkmen could. A milkman in a border state might need heavy winter gear one morning and find himself sweating in a lighter coat the very next day, as a cold front passed through and then retreated within 48 hours. Mountain and high-altitude regions presented their own particular winter challenges, with routes that included steep, icy roads difficult for both horses and early trucks to navigate safely. Milkmen in these areas often developed specialized knowledge of which streets to avoid entirely during and immediately after a snowstorm, rerouting their entire morning schedule around treacherous hills that became genuinely dangerous once ice formed on their surface. Coastal regions, meanwhile, often dealt with a different kind of winter weather entirely, less extreme cold in raw temperature terms, but frequently damp, windy, and prone to ice storms that coated every surface in a treacherous glaze far more dangerous underfoot than ordinary snow. A milkman working a coastal route during an ice storm faced some of the most hazardous conditions of the entire profession, walking across porches and sidewalks that had become essentially sheets of glass, carrying a heavy load of bottles that made a fall considerably more dangerous than it would have been empty-handed. Despite these regional differences, certain elements of the milkman's winter experience remained remarkably consistent from coast to coast. The impossibly early start, the constant battle against the cold, the quiet intimacy with a town's daily rhythms, and the simple, repetitive physical labor of carrying bottles from vehicle to porch, porch to vehicle, house after house, for hours at a time, regardless of what the thermometer read that particular morning. The specific gear a milkman relied upon to survive a winter route deserves its own careful attention, since these were not simply personal choices, but a kind of practical uniform shaped by decades of trial and error, passed down informally from older milkmen to younger ones just beginning the trade. The coat, as mentioned earlier, was perhaps the single most important piece of equipment, and milkmen developed strong opinions about which materials performed best. Wool remained a favorite for generations, prized for its ability to retain warmth even when damp, an important quality given how often a milkman's clothing became at least slightly wet from snow, sleet, or his own sweat generated through hours of physical exertion despite the cold. Canvas outer layers, sometimes treated with wax or oil to resist moisture, provided a wind-blocking exterior that many milkmen layered over their wool garments for maximum protection. Gloves presented a particular challenge, since the job required enough hand dexterity to grip glass bottles securely, handle coins for payment, and manage reins or a steering wheel, while also providing meaningful protection from the cold. Many milkmen settled on thin leather gloves worn under thicker wool mittens that could be quickly removed for tasks requiring more precise finger movement, then pulled back on between stops to preserve warmth. Some developed the habit of keeping a spare pair of dry gloves in the vehicle's cab, swapping out a pair that had become damp from snow contact partway through the route. Hats varied by personal preference and by decade, ranging from simple wool caps to the more structured caps that became associated with the delivery uniform. Many dairy companies eventually required their milkmen to wear as a form of professional branding. Ear protection mattered enormously in the coldest regions, and milkmen working in particularly harsh winter climates often wore caps with fold-down ear flaps, tied beneath the chin, a practical modification that sacrificed a small measure of professional appearance for genuine protection against frostbite. Boots, as discussed, received perhaps the most careful personal attention of any piece of equipment, since foot comfort and warmth directly determined how effectively a milkman could navigate icy porches and frozen sidewalks for hours at a stretch. Rubber overshoes, worn atop regular leather work boots, became popular specifically for their ability to shed snow and ice more effectively than leather alone, and many milkmen kept a spare pair of dry socks in their vehicle, changing partway through a route if their feet had become uncomfortably damp. Beyond personal clothing, the tools of the trade itself required winter-specific adaptations. Bottle carriers, typically wire baskets designed to hold several bottles securely while leaving the milkman's hands partially free, sometimes needed modification in icy conditions to prevent bottles from sliding or shifting unexpectedly as the milkman navigated uneven, frozen ground. Some milkmen added simple padding or dividers to their carriers, specifically to reduce the risk of bottles clinking together and cracking in cold temperatures, since glass becomes measurably more brittle as temperatures drop, a fact that made careful handling even more important during the coldest months of the year than during the milder seasons. Though a milkman's route was fundamentally a solitary occupation, conducted largely alone in the dark hours before a town woke, he was never entirely without company. Winter mornings, in particular, revealed an entire hidden layer of American town life that most residents never witnessed. The small community of early workers who kept the town functioning while everyone else slept. Bakers, often starting their ovens even earlier than the milkman began his route, sometimes crossed paths with him at a shared intersection, or a favorite early morning diner that opened its doors at impossibly early hours specifically to serve this population of pre-dawn workers. Newspaper delivery workers, coal deliverymen in regions still relying on coal heat, night shift factory workers heading home just as the milkman headed out, and the occasional police officer finishing a night patrol all became familiar, if not deeply known, faces within this small nocturnal world. A kind of informal camaraderie developed among these early workers, built on shared experience of the cold and the strange, quiet hours most of the town never saw. A milkman passing a baker already elbow-deep in dough might exchange a brief wave or a quick comment about the brutal cold that morning. A diner that opened at 4 in the morning specifically to catch this population of workers became something of an informal gathering spot, where milkmen from competing dairies, despite technically being commercial rivals, would sit at the same counter, drink the same strong coffee, and complain good-naturedly about the same icy roads and frozen bottles that plagued them all equally, regardless of which company's name was painted on the side of their truck. These brief moments of human connection, scattered throughout an otherwise solitary and repetitive job, mattered more than they might first appear. They provided milkmen with a support network for practical knowledge, which roads had been plowed, which had not, where a particularly bad patch of ice had formed overnight, which houses along a shared portion of a route had reported break-ins or suspicious activity that all delivery workers should watch for. This informal information network, built through nothing more than brief early morning encounters repeated over months and years, functioned as a genuinely useful safety and efficiency system long before any formal communication technology existed to serve the same purpose. For much of the milkman's long history, the entire profession existed because of a single, simple limitation. The American household had no reliable way to keep food cold for extended periods. This absence shaped everything about daily life, not just the delivery of milk, and it is worth pausing to consider just how different the rhythm of an ordinary household was in an age before mechanical refrigeration became standard. Before electric refrigerators became common in American homes, many families relied on iceboxes, simple insulated wooden cabinets cooled by a large block of ice delivered separately by an entirely different tradesman, the iceman, whose morning route often overlapped in spirit, if not in schedule, with the milkman's own. An icebox could keep food cool for a period of days, but nothing approaching the consistent, deep cold of later refrigeration technology, meaning that milk purchased in any quantity beyond a single day's needs risk spoiling before it could be consumed. This single practical fact explains why daily milk delivery became such a deeply embedded institution in American life. It was not simply a convenient service. For a significant stretch of the 20th century, it was close to necessity for any family without more sophisticated cooling technology, which described the overwhelming majority of American households for a longer period than modern audiences often realize. As mechanical refrigeration slowly spread through American homes across the middle decades of the century, the fundamental logic supporting daily milk delivery began to shift, gradually and unevenly, but unmistakably. A family with a reliable electric refrigerator could purchase milk in larger quantities and store it safely for many days, reducing their dependence on daily delivery and opening the door to alternative purchasing habits, particularly the emerging model of purchasing milk directly from a grocery store alongside the rest of a family's weekly shopping. This transition did not happen overnight, and it did not happen at the same pace everywhere. Wealthier households in urban areas tended to adopt refrigeration technology earlier, while rural and lower-income households often continued relying on daily delivery and less sophisticated cooling methods for considerably longer. Winter itself created an interesting temporary exception to this broader trend in refrigeration's early years, since cold outdoor temperatures could serve, however imperfectly and inconsistently, as a kind of natural refrigeration during the coldest months, somewhat reducing the urgency of daily delivery during winter specifically, even in households that still relied primarily on delivery during the warmer months of the year. The glass bottle, so central to the entire milkman tradition, eventually gave way to alternative packaging that would ultimately transform, and in many ways diminish, the entire delivery profession this piece has spent so much time describing. Paper cartons, waxed to resist moisture, began appearing as an alternative to glass bottles, offering advantages that glass simply could not match. Lighter weight, reduced breakage, and perhaps most significantly, the ability to be discarded after use rather than requiring collection, washing, and reuse. This last point mattered enormously to the economics of dairy operations, since the entire system of glass bottle collection, cleaning, sterilizing, and refilling represented a significant ongoing operational cost that a disposable paper carton eliminated entirely. For the milkman himself, This shift changed the physical nature of his daily work in subtle but meaningful ways. Glass bottles required careful handling both to prevent breakage and to facilitate their collection and return to the dairy for reuse. Paper cartons, being disposable, removed the collection step from his route entirely, simplifying his morning work in one sense while also, gradually, removing one of the small rituals that had structured the relationship between milkman and customer for so long. The simple exchange of empty bottle for full one, a moment of implicit communication that occurred silently at every stop on every route, every single morning, for generations. Plastic packaging arrived even later, offering further advantages in weight, cost, and durability, and eventually plastic jugs and cartons became the dominant form of milk packaging throughout the American grocery store system, a system that itself was becoming the dominant method by which American families obtained their milk, gradually displacing home delivery almost entirely by the final decades of the 20th century. Winter played a small but interesting role in this packaging transition as well. Paper and plastic packaging, it turned out, behaved somewhat differently than glass when milk froze inside them. Glass bottles, as previously described, sometimes cracked or had their caps pushed upward by expanding frozen milk. Paper cartons could bulge and occasionally split along their seams under the same conditions, while plastic jugs, being more flexible, tended to expand somewhat without failing entirely, though frozen milk in any container remained a quality problem regardless of the packaging material surrounding it. The gradual decline of home milk delivery as a widespread American institution did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen for any single reason, but rather emerged from the slow accumulation of several converging trends across many decades. The spread of household refrigeration, as already discussed, reduced the practical necessity of daily delivery. The rise of the automobile-centered American household made a weekly trip to a supermarket increasingly convenient, particularly as supermarkets themselves grew larger, more numerous, and more centrally located within easy driving distance of most American families. These supermarkets could offer milk at lower prices than home delivery services, since they benefited from economies of scale, reduced labor costs compared to maintaining an entire delivery workforce, and the efficiency of consolidating milk purchasing into the same shopping trip, where a family bought all their other groceries. Labor costs for dairies rose steadily across the decades, while the profit margins on home delivery remained thin, creating mounting financial pressure on dairy companies to either significantly raise prices for home delivery service, a move that risked driving remaining customers toward cheaper grocery store alternatives, or to gradually wind down their delivery operations altogether in favor of simply selling wholesale to grocery stores and letting customers handle their own transportation and storage of the product. Many smaller, independent dairies, unable to compete with the pricing and efficiency of larger companies increasingly focused on grocery store distribution, closed entirely or were acquired by larger regional or national dairy companies over the course of the mid to late 20th century. The milkman himself, once an essential and universally recognized figure in American town life, gradually became rarer, then unusual, than in most parts of the country, essentially a historical curiosity remembered primarily by older generations who could recall the daily rhythm of bottles left on porches, and the particular sound of a delivery truck's engine idling outside in the pre-dawn dark. A small number of dairies and delivery services persisted through this broader decline, often surviving by emphasizing qualities that grocery store milk could not easily replicate. Genuinely fresher product, delivered directly and quickly rather than sitting for extended periods in a store's refrigerated case, along with a kind of nostalgic appeal to customers who specifically valued the tradition and personal service that home delivery represented. These surviving services, though a small fraction of what the industry had once been at its historical peak, demonstrated that the underlying appeal of the milkman's daily visit never entirely disappeared from American cultural memory, even as it became a much smaller and more specialized part of the broader dairy industry. Though the daily reality of milk delivery gradually faded from most American communities, the memory and cultural imagery of the milkman proved remarkably durable, persisting in American cultural consciousness long after the actual profession had become rare. This durability says something interesting about which elements of the milkman's daily winter routine captured the public imagination most powerfully. It was rarely the economic details of dairy operations or the technical specifications of insulated delivery boxes that lingered in cultural memory. Instead, it was the simple, almost mythic image of quiet, dedicated service performed in darkness and cold, while the rest of the town slept peacefully, unaware of the effort required to ensure their morning milk would be waiting, fresh and undisturbed, on their doorstep. Families who had grown up with milk delivery often described this memory with a specific kind of fondness, recalling small details that had nothing directly to do with the milk itself. The particular sound of bottles clinking together in the pre-dawn quiet, the sight of small footprints in fresh snow leading up to their porch when they woke and looked out their window, the simple, reassuring predictability of a service that never failed to appear, regardless of how brutal the previous night's storm had been. This nostalgic memory, though real and widely shared, existed somewhat separately from the harder, more physically demanding reality this piece has spent considerable time describing. The genuine cold endured for hours at a stretch, the very real physical risks of navigating icy porches while carrying a heavy and fragile load, the long, often underpaid hours required to complete a full route before the rest of the town had even begun their own day. The milkman remembered fondly by grateful customers was, in his own daily experience, engaged in genuinely difficult, physically demanding labor, performed reliably and often without complaint, for reasons that ranged from simple economic necessity to a genuine, quiet pride in providing an essential service to his community. Both of these truths, the nostalgic cultural memory and the harder physical reality, existed simultaneously and were not in any real contradiction with one another. A job could be physically demanding, cold, and difficult, while also representing something genuinely valuable and worth remembering fondly by the community it served. This duality, in many ways, captures something true about a great deal of essential, unglamorous labor throughout American history. Work performed quietly, reliably, and without much public recognition, that nonetheless made an enormous, largely invisible contribution to the daily functioning and comfort of ordinary community life. Let us end, as this kind of quiet historical reflection often does, with a single imagined morning built from the countless small details already described throughout this piece, brought together into one continuous, unhurried scene. The milkman wakes in the deep dark of early morning, the house around him still and cold, his wife and children still asleep in the warm quiet of their beds. He dresses slowly, layer by layer, wool against skin, flannel over wool, heavy coat over flannel, until the cold waiting for him beyond his front door feels slightly less threatening than it did in the first sleepy moments after waking. He steps outside, and his breath immediately hangs visible in the still air. Snow crunches softly beneath his boots as he makes his way toward the dairy, where wire crates of glass bottles wait to be loaded, their glass surfaces already carrying a faint chill from the dairy's cooling room. He loads his vehicle carefully, methodically, arranging bottles according to a route memorized so completely that conscious thought barely enters the process. The route begins, house by house, porch by porch, through streets and neighborhoods rendered nearly unrecognizable by snow and darkness, yet perfectly familiar to a man who has walked this same path hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before. He climbs icy steps carefully, exchanges empty bottles for full ones, closes delivery boxes gently to avoid unnecessary noise, and moves on to the next stop, and the next, hour after hour, as the sky slowly begins to lighten from pure black to the deep blue that precedes true dawn. Occasionally he encounters another early worker, a baker already deep into his morning's labor, a newspaper carrier finishing a route of his own, and they exchange brief nods or quiet words about the brutal cold, before continuing on with their separate tasks. Occasionally he pauses a moment longer at a particular house, checking quietly that all appears well, before continuing on his way. By the time the sun finally rises, casting pale winter light across snow-covered rooftops and frost-covered windows, the milkman's route is nearly complete. Families across the town are only now beginning to stir, unaware entirely of the hours of quiet, cold labor that have already ensured fresh milk waits for them on their doorsteps, exactly as it has every single morning, regardless of the weather, regardless of the difficulty, delivered by a man whose name most of them barely know, but whose daily reliability has become such a deeply embedded part of their lives that they would notice, immediately and with real concern, the single morning it failed to appear. He finishes his route, returns his empty crates to the dairy, and makes his way home, where warmth, breakfast, and rest finally wait for him, however briefly, before the entire cycle begins again the following morning, in the same deep, silent hours before dawn, regardless of how cold the night before had been, regardless of how much snow had fallen while the town slept. This was the real routine of an American milkman in winter. Not a glamorous or dramatic profession, but a quiet, demanding, essential one, performed faithfully across generations, in darkness and cold, so that ordinary families could wake each morning to something as simple and as easily taken for granted as a bottle of fresh milk waiting patiently on their porch. A milkman did not need a thermometer or a textbook to understand the physics of cold. He understood it through years of direct, repeated experience, through trial and error, through small mistakes made once and never repeated. This practical, lived understanding of winter's behavior deserves its own careful attention, since it shaped nearly every decision he made across a long delivery route. He knew, for instance, that cold did not behave uniformly across a single morning. The coldest point of any winter night was rarely at midnight, when many people assumed temperatures reached their lowest point. Instead, the deepest cold typically arrived just before dawn, in the hour or two before sunrise, when the earth had radiated away the last of the previous day's stored warmth, and the sun had not yet begun to return any of it. This meant that the milkman's earliest hours on his route, the very hours when he began loading bottles at the dairy and setting out on his first deliveries, coincided almost exactly with the coldest temperatures of the entire 24-hour cycle, a cruel but consistent pattern he had long since stopped finding remarkable. He also understood, through repeated experience rather than formal education, that different types of cold created different practical problems. A dry, still cold, however low the temperature reading, was often more tolerable than a damp, windy cold at a slightly higher temperature, because moisture and wind both accelerated the loss of body heat far more effectively than dry, still air ever could. A milkman working a coastal route in a damp, windy 30-degree morning often suffered more acutely than a milkman working an inland route in a dry, still 10-degree morning, despite the 20-degree difference in the thermometer reading, a fact that shaped his choice of clothing and his expectations for how difficult any given morning's route would feel. Wind itself became a subject of careful practical study. A milkman quickly learned which streets on his route offered some natural shelter from prevailing winter winds, perhaps due to the direction certain buildings faced, or the presence of trees or hills that blocked the worst of the gusts, and which streets, by contrast, seemed to funnel wind directly and mercilessly along their length, creating a corridor of biting cold that made even a short walk from truck to porch feel considerably longer and more punishing than the actual distance would suggest. Over years of repeated exposure, milkmen developed an almost intuitive sense for which specific stretches of their route demanded the most bracing before they stepped out of the relative shelter of their vehicle. Snow itself, too, varied in ways that mattered enormously to a man walking through it dozens of times each morning. Freshly fallen powder, light and dry, was relatively easy to walk through, offering decent traction and posing little risk of slipping, though it made accurate footing harder to judge in the dark, since the exact contours of steps and pathways disappeared beneath an even blanket of white. Older snow, partially melted by a brief warm spell, and then refrozen into a hard, icy crust, presented an entirely different and more dangerous challenge, since this surface could support a person's weight momentarily before suddenly giving way, or could offer no traction at all on a slope or incline, sending an unprepared walker sliding without warning. The most dangerous condition of all, by near universal agreement among milkmen across different regions and different decades, was a thin, nearly invisible layer of ice, sometimes called black ice, formed when a light rain or the day's brief thaw refroze overnight into a surface so smooth and transparent that it blended almost seamlessly with the pavement or wood beneath it, offering no visual warning before a foot met it and slid without any resistance whatsoever. This accumulated practical knowledge of cold, wind, and snow was rarely written down or formally taught. It passed from older, more experienced milkmen to younger ones through casual conversation, through shared mornings at the dairy loading dock, through the simple observation of how an experienced colleague dressed, walked, and timed his route differently depending on the specific winter conditions of a given morning. It was a body of knowledge every bit as real and valuable as any formal scientific training, even though it existed almost entirely in the accumulated muscle memory, an instinct of men who had spent years directly exposed to winter's full range of behavior. Winter, to a milkman, was never a single uniform season, but rather a sequence of distinct phases, each with its own character, its own particular challenges, and its own psychological texture that shaped his mood and expectations as he moved through the cold months of the year. Early winter, typically the weeks surrounding the transition from autumn into true cold, carried a particular quality of adjustment and readjustment. The body, still accustomed to the milder temperatures of the preceding months, had not yet built up its tolerance for genuine cold, making the first truly frigid mornings of the season feel disproportionately harsh compared to how the same temperature might feel later in the winter, once the body had adapted somewhat to sustained cold exposure. Milkmen often described this early period as the hardest psychologically, precisely because the shock of the transition felt sharper than the discomfort of deep winter itself, once a person had settled into the routine and rhythm the cold demanded. There was also, in this early winter period, a practical scramble to prepare properly for the months ahead. Coats needed checking for wear from the previous year, boots needed waterproofing or replacement if the soles had worn thin, and vehicles, whether horse-drawn or motorized, needed whatever winterizing procedures the milkman had learned to perform through years of experience. Checking a horse's blanket for damage, or ensuring a truck's antifreeze, battery, and tire condition were adequate for the demands the coming months would place upon them. Midwinter, the deepest and coldest stretch of the season, brought a different psychological quality entirely, one of grim, settled endurance rather than adjustment. By this point, the milkman had fully adapted his routine, his clothing, and his expectations to match the season's demands. There was less shock in midwinter cold, since the body and mind had both adjusted to expect it, but there was also less relief, no sense of an ending in sight, simply the steady, repetitive grind of the coldest weeks of the year stretching out ahead with no immediate change expected. Milkmen often described this period using words like monotonous or relentless, rather than shocking or difficult. A subtle but meaningful distinction that speaks to how thoroughly the human body and mind can adapt to even genuinely harsh conditions, given enough time and repetition. Late winter brought its own distinct character, one shaped by the earliest, often barely perceptible signs that the season's grip was beginning to loosen, even while genuinely difficult weather often continued for weeks or even months longer. A slightly earlier hint of light in the eastern sky during the final stretch of the morning route, a slightly less brutal edge to the wind on an otherwise still cold morning. Small changes barely noticeable to anyone not paying extremely close attention became genuinely significant sources of psychological encouragement to milkmen who had spent months enduring the deepest cold of the year. This period sometimes proved treacherous in its own right, however, since late winter often brought the most dramatic temperature swings of the entire season, alternating between brief warm spells that created dangerous melting and refreezing cycles, and sudden late-season cold snaps that caught milkmen off guard precisely because they had begun, prematurely, to expect the worst of winter to be behind them. This entire seasonal arc, repeated year after year across an entire career, created a kind of deep internal calendar within the milkman's body and mind, an accumulated sense of exactly what each part of winter demanded, and exactly how his own body would respond to it, built not from any external measurement, but from decades of direct, repeated, physical experience with the specific rhythms of cold in his particular region of the country. Winter, in the American calendar, contained several major holidays, and the milkman's relationship with these holidays reveals another layer of texture in his daily working life, one shaped by the simple fact that milk, unlike many other goods and services, could not simply pause for a holiday without creating real hardship for the families depending on it. Christmas presented a particular case study in this ongoing tension between holiday celebration and essential service. Most towns did not expect their milkman to skip Christmas morning delivery entirely, since families still needed fresh milk regardless of the holiday, particularly households anticipating a large gathering of relatives who would need considerably more milk than an ordinary day's order to accommodate a house full of guests over the holiday period. This meant that many milkmen rose at their usual impossibly early hour on Christmas morning itself, completed their full route in the same cold darkness as any other winter morning, and only afterward returned home to join their own family's holiday celebration, arriving perhaps slightly later than they might have liked, but present nonetheless for the parts of the day that mattered most to his own household. Some customers, aware of this reality, developed small traditions specifically around their milkman's Christmas morning route. A family might leave a small gift, perhaps a plate of cookies or a modest cash tip, alongside their empty bottles the night before Christmas Eve, a small gesture of gratitude for a service the milkman provided faithfully throughout the entire year, including on a morning when most of the town remained comfortably asleep far later than their usual schedule. Milkmen often described these small holiday gestures with genuine warmth, small moments of recognition that stood out against the otherwise largely invisible, unacknowledged nature of most of their daily work. New Year's morning presented its own particular challenge, since it followed a night when a considerable portion of the town had likely stayed awake far later than usual, celebrating the arrival of the new year, meaning that the milkman's pre-dawn arrival on New Year's morning often coincided with households only just beginning to settle into sleep after a late night of celebration. Some milkmen developed a habit of moving with particular quiet care on this specific morning, aware that an unusually loud clink of bottles might disturb a household that had only just, finally, managed to fall asleep after a long night of festivities. Thanksgiving, falling earlier in the season before the deepest cold had typically arrived, presented fewer weather-related challenges than the deeper winter holidays, but brought its own version of the same basic pattern. families needing significantly larger milk orders to accommodate holiday cooking and gathered relatives, and a milkman adjusting his loads and his route timing accordingly to meet this predictable seasonal surge in demand. Across all of these winter holidays, a consistent theme emerges. The milkman's work did not pause for celebration in the way that many other aspects of American commercial life did. This was not because dairies were indifferent to their workers' own holiday needs, but simply because the product itself, fresh milk needed daily by ordinary families, did not respect a calendar in the way that many other goods and services could afford to. This reality placed a genuine, if rarely discussed, burden on milkmen and their families across generations, a burden largely invisible to the customers who benefited from a service that never seemed to pause, regardless of what the calendar said about a particular morning's significance. Though most of a milkman's deliveries happened while households slept, children occupied a curious and memorable place within the broader cultural memory of this profession, since the earliest rising children in any given household sometimes did catch a glimpse of the milkman during his rounds, particularly on winter mornings when school schedules and a child's own natural early waking coincided with the tail end of his route. For many children who grew up during the era of home milk delivery, the milkman represented one of the earliest and most reliable figures of adult authority and dependability they encountered outside their own immediate family. He arrived, without fail, at almost exactly the same time each morning, a level of predictability that many children found genuinely comforting in a world that, from a child's perspective, often felt unpredictable and confusing in countless other ways. Some milkmen, aware of this small audience of early rising children, developed small traditions specifically for them. A friendly wave through a frosted window, a brief pause to allow a bundled-up child to watch the horse or the truck up close, or in some documented cases, a small treat kept specifically for children who happened to catch him during his route, became cherished memories passed down through families for generations afterward, told and retold at holiday gatherings decades after the actual milkman himself had retired, or the entire practice of home delivery had faded from that particular town. Winter mornings created particularly vivid memories for these children, precisely because the visual drama of the season, snow, frost, visible breath, the specific golden quality of early winter light, combined with the milkman's already memorable presence to create images that stuck powerfully in childhood memory. Adults recalling their childhood decades later often describe these winter morning glimpses of the milkman with unusually specific sensory detail. The particular sound of the truck's engine, the exact color of the milkman's coat, the precise way frost had gathered on his eyebrows during an especially cold week, details that had somehow persisted in memory across 50 or 60 years, long after countless other, arguably more significant childhood memories had faded entirely. This particular thread of cultural memory, of the milkman as a source of comfort and reliability specifically observed through a child's eyes, contributed significantly to the broader nostalgic image of the profession that persisted in American cultural consciousness long after home delivery itself had become rare. The milkman remembered fondly in later decades was, in a very real sense, remembered partly through the eyes of the children who had once watched him from frosted windows on cold winter mornings, forming impressions that would remain vivid and warm for the rest of their lives. It would be incomplete, and in some ways dishonest, to describe this profession without acknowledging directly the genuine physical toll that decades of winter milk delivery placed on the men who performed this work across their entire careers. The repetitive nature of the labor, carrying heavy loads up icy steps hundreds of times each morning, day after day, year after year, placed considerable and cumulative strain on the body, particularly the back, knees, and shoulders. Many milkmen, interviewed later in life after retiring from the profession, described chronic joint pain and back problems that they directly attributed to decades spent navigating icy, uneven terrain while carrying heavy, awkward loads of glass bottles. The cold itself, endured for hours at a stretch across dozens of winters over a full career, carried its own long-term physical costs. Frostbite, while rarely severe enough to cause permanent damage in most cases, was nonetheless a genuine and recurring risk, particularly affecting fingers, toes, ears, and the exposed skin of the face during the coldest and most prolonged stretches of a difficult winter route. Milkmen developed practical strategies to minimize this risk, but complete avoidance was rarely possible across an entire career spent working through the harshest weather American winters could produce. Falls on icy surfaces represented perhaps the single most immediate and acute physical danger of the profession, and nearly every long-serving milkman could recall at least one, and often several, significant falls across the span of a career, ranging from minor bruises and embarrassment to more serious injuries requiring genuine medical attention and time away from work. The combination of poor pre-dawn visibility, treacherous icy surfaces, and the awkward physical burden of carrying loaded bottle baskets created a combination of risk factors that made falls a near-inevitable part of the profession's long-term physical reality, rather than a rare or unusual occurrence. Despite these genuine physical costs, remarkably few milkmen, when interviewed later in life, expressed significant regret about their choice of profession. Many instead emphasized the sense of purpose and quiet pride they had derived from providing an essential daily service to their community, the satisfaction of mastering a genuinely difficult physical and logistical challenge through years of accumulated skill and experience, and the particular quality of solitude and quiet reflection that came from spending so many hours alone in the pre-dawn darkness. A kind of meditative solitude that several retired milkmen specifically identified as something they missed after leaving the profession behind, even while acknowledging without hesitation the genuine physical hardship the work had demanded of them across their careers. In later decades, as home milk delivery faded into rarity and then into near-total absence across most of the country, historians, local newspaper writers, and curious grandchildren occasionally sat down with retired milkmen to record their memories before those memories disappeared entirely along with the generation that held them. What emerges from these scattered, informal accounts is not a single unified story, but a collection of small, specific, deeply personal recollections that together paint a fuller picture than any single description could manage alone. One retired milkman, having spent over 30 years delivering milk across a small Midwestern town, described his winter mornings not primarily in terms of the cold itself, but in terms of the particular quality of silence he encountered before dawn. He recalled that the silence of a snow-covered town in the deep hours before sunrise had a physical quality to it, a kind of muffled stillness created by the snow itself absorbing sound in a way that bare pavement never could. He described this silence as something he had come to treasure over the years, a form of solitude that he found genuinely difficult to locate anywhere else in his daily life, and one he mentioned missing specifically after retirement, even while acknowledging that he did not miss the cold itself, nor the physical strain the work had placed on his knees and back over 3 decades of daily labor. Another account, from a woman who had taken over her father's milk route in a small town after his health declined, offered a different perspective, since she represented one of a smaller number of women who worked directly on delivery routes during an era when the profession was overwhelmingly dominated by men. She described facing particular skepticism from some customers initially, uncertain whether a woman could handle the physical demands of the job, skepticism that faded within her first difficult winter, once neighbors observed her handling the same icy porches, the same heavy loads, and the same brutal early hours with the same steady reliability her father had demonstrated for years before her. She recalled one particularly severe ice storm during her second winter on the route, during which she had continued her deliveries despite genuinely hazardous conditions, an experience she described afterward with a mixture of pride and lingering caution, having fallen twice that particular morning without serious injury, but recognizing clearly afterward just how easily the outcome could have been considerably worse. A third account, from a man who had worked a rural route requiring considerably longer distances between individual customers than a typical town route, emphasized the particular isolation of his specific version of the job. Where a town milkman might walk relatively short distances between closely spaced houses, a rural milkman often drove considerable distances along isolated country roads between individual farmhouses, meaning that a mechanical breakdown or an accident in deep winter carried genuinely serious risk, given the limited likelihood of another vehicle passing by to offer assistance in a remote area during the earliest, coldest hours of a winter morning. This particular milkman described carrying emergency supplies specifically for this reason: extra blankets, matches, and food, treating every winter morning's route with the same careful preparation a person might apply to a genuine wilderness expedition, given the real isolation his particular rural route involved. These varied personal accounts, though describing somewhat different specific circumstances, share certain consistent threads: a deep, practical mastery of winter conditions built through years of direct experience, genuine physical hardship endured as an accepted and largely unremarked upon part of the job, and an underlying sense of quiet pride in performing essential, reliable service to a community, regardless of how difficult or how invisible that service often remained to the people who benefited from it most directly. Behind the quiet, solitary image of the individual milkman making his rounds sat a more complicated commercial reality, since most American towns of any significant size supported multiple competing dairy companies simultaneously, each maintaining their own separate delivery routes, their own milkmen, and their own competitive strategies for winning and retaining customers within the same limited local market. This competition shaped the daily experience of the profession in ways that might not be immediately obvious from the outside. Milkmen representing competing dairies often worked overlapping territories, meaning it was entirely common for 2 or 3 different milkmen, employed by entirely separate companies, to service houses located directly across the street from one another, or even within the very same block, depending on which dairy each individual household happened to have chosen as their supplier. Winter conditions added an interesting dimension to this ongoing commercial rivalry. A dairy that developed a particular reputation for reliable delivery even during the most severe winter storms, when competitors sometimes suspended service temporarily due to hazardous road conditions, could use this reputation as a genuine competitive advantage, appealing specifically to customers who valued absolute reliability above all other considerations. Some dairies explicitly instructed their milkmen to make every reasonable effort to complete their routes even during severe weather, viewing this reliability as a core part of their brand identity and competitive positioning within their local market. This commercial pressure created genuine tension for individual milkmen, who found themselves balancing legitimate concerns about personal safety during genuinely hazardous winter conditions against their employers' expectations regarding route completion and reliable service. Most dairies, to their credit, generally allowed reasonable individual judgment regarding when conditions had become too dangerous to continue, but the underlying competitive pressure to maintain an unbroken record of reliable delivery, regardless of weather, remained a real and sometimes uncomfortable factor shaping decisions made by individual milkmen and the dairy managers who supervised their routes. Beyond simple reliability, dairies competed on numerous other fronts as well: pricing, the specific quality and freshness of their product, the variety of additional items available for delivery alongside basic milk, such as cream, butter, eggs, or the increasingly popular chocolate milk that grew in popularity across the middle decades of the 20th century, and the personal relationship and reputation of the individual milkman assigned to a particular route. A well-liked, reliable milkman with a good personal rapport with his customers represented a genuine competitive asset for his employing dairy, and some dairies specifically worked to retain popular, long-serving milkmen on the same routes for years or even decades, recognizing the customer loyalty that a familiar, trusted face could generate far more effectively than any advertising campaign or pricing strategy alone could achieve. Despite the careful routines, accumulated experience, and practical wisdom described throughout this piece, winter mornings occasionally produced genuine emergencies and difficulties that tested a milkman's resourcefulness and resilience well beyond the ordinary demands of his daily route. Vehicle breakdowns represented one of the most common and immediately disruptive problems a milkman might encounter. A truck that failed to start on an especially cold morning, or that broke down partway through a route due to frozen fuel lines or a dead battery, left a milkman with difficult choices to make in the pre-dawn darkness. Some milkmen, in these situations, resorted to completing at least a portion of their route on foot, carrying as many bottles as they could manage by hand to the nearest and most essential stops, prioritizing households with infants or elderly residents most likely to genuinely need their delivery that particular morning, while accepting that more distant or less urgent stops would simply need to wait for a later, makeshift delivery once the vehicle problem had been resolved. Severe winter storms occasionally created situations serious enough that even the most dedicated milkman found continuing his route genuinely impossible or genuinely unsafe to attempt. Blizzard conditions, with visibility reduced to only a few feet and roads rendered entirely impassable by deep, drifting snow, forced even the most reliability-focused dairies to accept that some mornings simply could not be serviced as usual. In these rare but memorable situations, milkmen sometimes described making the difficult decision to turn back partway through a route already begun, a decision that weighed heavily against their strong professional instinct toward completing every task they had started, but one that ultimately reflected sound judgment when conditions had genuinely become too dangerous to continue. Personal injuries during the course of a route, while thankfully rarely severe, occurred with enough regularity across the profession's long history that most experienced milkmen developed informal personal protocols for handling them. A significant fall resulting in a sprained ankle or wrist required difficult decisions about whether to continue the remainder of a route despite the injury. Given the strong sense of professional obligation many milkmen felt toward their waiting customers, or whether to seek help and abandon the remaining deliveries for that particular morning. Accepting the inconvenience this would cause to customers further along the uncompleted route. Perhaps the most serious category of winter emergency involved situations where a milkman himself became stranded or lost, particularly in rural areas where routes covered considerable distances between isolated farmhouses along country roads that could become genuinely disorienting during a severe snowstorm. When familiar landmarks disappeared beneath uniform white drifts and visibility dropped low enough to make even a well-known route feel suddenly unfamiliar and disorienting. Several documented historical accounts describe rural milkmen becoming genuinely stranded during unexpected severe storms, forced to seek shelter at the nearest available farmhouse until conditions improved enough to safely continue or return home, relying on the same rural community bonds and mutual assistance that generally characterized small agricultural communities during this era of American history. These occasional emergencies, though relatively rare compared to the overwhelming majority of routine, uneventful winter mornings described throughout this piece, remind us that the milkman's daily work, however habitual and routine it may have felt to the men who performed it across entire careers, always carried genuine underlying risk, a fact that makes the remarkable, sustained reliability of daily milk delivery across so many decades of American winters all the more impressive when properly considered in full context. Eventually, across every winter this piece has described, spring arrived, gradually and unevenly, but unmistakably, bringing with it a genuine and welcome transformation in the daily experience of the milkman's route. The transition rarely happened suddenly. Rather, it unfolded across several weeks of gradually improving conditions, slightly warmer mornings interspersed unpredictably with occasional lingering cold snaps, slightly earlier daylight extending the portion of the route completed in genuine morning light rather than pre-dawn darkness, and a slow, welcome reduction in the layers of clothing required to remain comfortable through a full morning's work. Milkmen often describe this seasonal transition with genuine relief, though tempered by an interesting recognition that winter, despite its genuine hardships, had also provided a particular structure and rhythm to their working lives that milder seasons, in their own way, lacked. The deep cold demanded careful preparation, careful attention to conditions, and a kind of heightened alertness that some milkmen found, upon reflection, oddly satisfying to master successfully across an entire difficult season, year after year. The final truly cold morning of any given winter rarely announced itself clearly in the moment, since no one could know in advance which particular morning would prove to be the last genuinely severe cold of the season. Only in retrospect, once several subsequent weeks had passed without any comparable return of deep winter conditions, could a milkman look back and recognize that a particular morning, unremarkable at the time beyond its ordinary difficulty, had in fact represented the final truly harsh test of that year's winter season. This annual cycle, repeated across an entire career spanning 20, 30, sometimes 40 years or more, created a deep and personal relationship between the individual milkman and the specific character of winter in his particular region of the country. A relationship built not from abstract knowledge, but from decades of direct, physical, repeated experience with cold, snow, ice, and the particular daily demands these conditions placed upon a profession, requiring reliable service regardless of what any given winter chose to bring. And so, winter after winter, year after year, the milkman rose in the deep darkness before dawn, dressed carefully against the cold, loaded his bottles, and made his way through quiet, snow-covered streets, delivering something as simple as milk to families who mostly never saw him do it. A small, essential, quietly heroic act repeated so many thousands of times across so many decades that it became, eventually, simply part of the fabric of American life itself. Until the world changed around it, and this particular quiet ritual gradually became something remembered rather than something lived, a piece of history preserved now mostly in old photographs, scattered personal recollections, and stories like this one, offered as a way of remembering work that mattered, performed by people who rarely asked for much recognition in return.